4, taxi to apron, no traffic.
Off.
Alternators.
Off.
Generators.
Off.
Passenger notices.
Off.
Cockpit lights.
All off here.
Nose steering.
Is off.
Foot heaters.
Off.
Trip record.
Checks complete.
Flying even a modest-sized aircraft like this is a relatively sophisticated business. 7 years of training, rigid examinations and so on. Makes you realise sometimes what tremendous advances there have been, well, within a lifetime. The early flyers had no one to train them. Nobody had been in the air before. Just look out there. When you think that those first aviators sat out in the open, perched on a bicycle seat, holding a couple of hand controls, certainly gives you pause to marvel. The story of flight in New Zealand is particularly varied and inventive, and I think all the more remarkable for this country's size and its isolation in those early days from the rest of the world. We were pioneers on so many frontiers, it's surprising we found the time to be among the very first to fly. Richard Pearse was the first person in the British Empire to leave the ground under power, yet he was unheard of until after his death in 1953. Argument still rages around Pearse as to just when he did fly and to what extent his flights were sustained and controlled or just haphazard. Here at Waitoa in South Canterbury, those who feel strongly that he did fly successfully and that he should be remembered put up this memorial to their growing local celebrity. In his day, Pearse was generally known as Mad Dick because of his tinkering with flying machines. The fact is, whether sustained and controlled as the records required or not, Pearse became airborne along this road and flew before crashing onto the top of a 12-foot high gorse hedge which bordered it on both sides in those days. And the date, it's claimed, was the 31st of March, 1903, 9 months before the world hailed the successful flight of the Wright brothers in the United States. Even more remarkable is that precisely a year before, Pearse made an earlier and longer flight. I went to the spot with Pearse's nephew and with Jim Crombie, chairman of the Pearse Memorial Committee. Although evidence continues to grow even to this day, is the belief that Pearse flew off this terrace above the Opahi River, which is 30 feet below, down through these trees which have grown up in the intervening years.
They headed him towards the cliff.
This was the same day, though, was it?
Yes, the same day. Oh, this all happened within an hour and a half.
Robert Gibson was an eyewitness.
And they headed him towards the cliff, and he got the engine going, which was a frightening noise, and he got the engine going like fun, and the boys started pushing to get him some speed up. And about halfway towards the cliff, that'd be, or they'd pushed him about a chain. It was going too fast for them to keep up with it. And away he went, and we watched him until he turned.
You saw him in the air?
We saw him in the air, over the cliff turning. He turned to go up the river. Well, then we cut across the paddock diagonally, about halfway from where he started to where he landed. We could watch from the cliff where he was going. He was just gradually going downwards.
How far from the cliff to where he landed would it have been, do you think?
It'd be anything up to half a mile. Anything up to half a mile that he went, in the air, before he landed in the Opahi.
Not far from the spot Pearse landed was the local rubbish tip, where discarded parts of Pearse's homemade engines were dumped from clearing out his workshop after he had left the district. The cylinders made from iron drain pipes.
Just recently, about 10 years ago, these are some of the parts of his original engines were found down in the riverbed here. This is the liner and one of the earliest engines. place for the plug, exhaust valve, inlet valve, and there were two cylinders to this engine,
And it generated enough energy to power an airplane.
25 horsepower of it, we're told. And evidence is gathering that this could have been in 1902.
That would have made it more than a year before the Wright brothers.
That's right.
This full-scale replica of Pierce's first machine is in the Museum of Transport and Technology, or MOTAT, in Auckland, reconstructed from patent notes and drawings, engine parts and eyewitness accounts. And this is the last machine he built. One wonders what Pierce might have achieved had he lived closer to civilization and the available technology of the time, instead of working away in a rural backwater and then later in Christchurch in a small and isolated country. Unfortunately, the world of aviation overtook him. He worked for years in secret on this amazing later machine, but it was obsolete long before he died, and it was discovered in a shed behind the home that he built and moved to in Christchurch. It was tragic that Pierce chose to work alone so laboriously, because this last machine incorporated several features well in advance of their time, the most notable being a variable pitch propeller and a rotating engine which would enable the machine to take off almost vertically. The New Zealand branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society has recently studied up-to-date evidence, and it agrees that Pierce almost certainly did make a flight of some sort on the 31st of March 1902. 1 year and 9 months before the Wright brothers. It was sustained flight, but the degree of control still remains in doubt, which means the Wright brothers are still not directly challenged. I think the spirit of Pierce's achievement is best summed up by a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society long interested in Pierce, the former General Manager and Chairman of Air New Zealand, Sir Geoffrey Roberts.
There are still some people who would try to discredit Richard Pierce. It matters little to me whether he flew before the Wright brothers or whether he did not. The fact remains that this remarkable man was pioneering powered flight at the turn of the century, at a time when sail was still giving way to steam at sea. He deserves to rank with Blériot and the Wright brothers as among the greats of early aviation.
Herbert Pither was another New Zealand pioneer, well after the Wright brothers, but still with a claim to some firsts in world aviation. Although his plane was photographed and his flights noted at the time, for some reason he became forgotten as time passed, and might be in obscurity still, but for the efforts of Morgan Long of Christchurch.
Southland News, and this photo was taken before the plane ever flew.
Morgan, what prompted your interest in Pither?
Well, during the war I was reading a book on early aviation and was quite intrigued with a particular chapter on Pither's achievements, so much so that I decided to carry out some research on this myself.
You actually took research to its ultimate and married a Pither?
I did, yes. During the course of my research I met Pither's brother and, of course, Pither's niece, and eventually married her.
Morgan, what was Pither's main contribution to New Zealand aviation?
The aircraft had many features, unique features. The framework was of all-metal construction, the propeller was of aluminium construction, the undercarriage had shock absorbers, and the engine was a V4 design.
His own design? He built his
own design of engine. In fact, he built two identical engines for this aircraft, one of which I found in a paddock near where the Invercargill Airport is.
And this is the motor that's now in MOTAT?
That's right. This is the engine which I sent up for display at MOTAT. You know, if it wasn't for all the research that I'd carried out over this number of years, the achievements of Pither would have been left in obscurity. And my research was further added to by research carried out in the United Kingdom by the United Services and Royal Aero Club, the premier world authority dealing with these matters, when in 1974, 64 years after the event, they recognised Pither's achievements as being the first powered and sustained flight in the world in an aircraft of all-metal construction.
The sad and ironic thing for both Pither and Pierce was their belated recognition. In fact, for Pierce, the battle may not be over yet. As I say, it's unfortunate that the early books about flight in New Zealand begin instead with the men who quite often imported ready-made or kit-set machines. Actually, flight as such really began with the balloonists, who gave themselves such impressive titles as professor or captain. Lancaster Park in Christchurch was a great place for it, although the first ascent in New Zealand was made by a Professor Baldwin in Dunedin in 1889. One of the most daring balloonists, who broke innumerable bones in forced landings and parachute jumps, was Captain Noah Jonasson, who styled himself the Aerial King. Clad in circus tights, these performers thrilled the crowds as they swung on trapezes or leapt with parachutes from their drifting dreadnoughts. Experiments with flying machines began while ballooning was still in its heyday. The first, given that no one had heard of Pither or Pierce, was Bertram Ogilvie of Napier in 1907. His efforts to become airborne from a 100-foot ramp ended in failure. Next came Arthur Schaeff of Wellington, who designed his aeroplane with the help of a Wellington engineer, Percy Fisher. Between 1911 and 14, Schaeff achieved brief hops and short erratic flights before his second plane was destroyed in a fire and he gave up any further attempts. In 1910, two brothers, Leo and Vivian Walsh of Auckland, had built their Manurera 1 from an imported kit set. The Walshes were soon to have a profound impact on New Zealand aviation. When Manurera 1 took to the air in February 1911, a year after Pither's flight, it was officially hailed as the country's first controlled flight. But the aircraft itself finally came to an unhappy end. Miller and Sanford followed in 1913 in another imported machine, and the same year saw the first flight to be recorded on a hand-cranked movie camera. Percy Fisher, who had helped Schaeff, had gone on to make his own Fisher monoplane. After engine trials, it was towed to a paddock near Carterton in the Wairarapa. There, after Fisher had made final checks on the engine, Reginald White volunteered to test it out.
Fisher had been running around on the ground with the wings off, trying to get used to the controls. And I said, what about letting me have a go at it? I wanted to see the machine, see if it would fly.
Fisher Airlines announced the departure of Flight 1 from Carterton.
I wasn't actually scared. I had more thought for the damage to the machine. It's funny that, you know, but I might say that before getting into the machine, I was scared. Well, I got about 10 feet off, and I sailed along for about 50 yards or so like that. It seemed to be quite easy to control. You could keep the height quite... what did we go up, Charlie? About 60 feet, I think. And she landed quite well, because she had good shock absorbers. Charlie wanted me to take him up with him on the back. It didn't come off, though, did it, Charlie? I don't know why. But, the engine wasn't reliable. We were scared the thing would seize up any time.
Others preferred to buy the machines. Showman Scotland, hailed by the Christchurch Star as an aviator with considerable experience of the birdman's art, gave displays in many parts of the country. In Wellington, he was persuaded to fly in a high wind against his own good judgment. The result? Scotland had to send to England for another machine. When Leo and Vivian Walsh established the New Zealand Flying School, which soon moved to Mission Bay, then known as part of Kohimarumara, here in Auckland, it was a very different place from what it is today. In fact, the only building was the Mission House, which is still here. In setting up their flying school to train Dominion pilots for the Royal Flying Corps in England at the start of World War I, the Walshes brought the first formal organisation to flying, in spite of a notable lack of support from the government of the day. The British Minister for War, back in 1909, had declared that aeroplanes were useless for military purposes, and his view was widespread. In New Zealand, it was still felt that we must learn to walk before we attempt to fly. And perhaps because of this prevailing attitude, we were the only Dominion, by the middle of 1915, which had still not sent qualified pilots to join the Royal Flying Corps. The Walsh brothers, and particularly Vivian, determined to put this right, and that year finally gained government approval, though without financial support, to set up their flying school. One of their first pupils, and soon their star instructor, was George Bolt, an outstanding pilot and engineer. To these men, instructors and pupils alike, the war must have seemed a long way off. One of George Bolt's pupils was Lawson Field, who later became one of the pioneers of aerial top dressing.
Get in and away we go. And I thought it was quite simple flying, you know. So I couldn't keep my knees still. Anyway, after a while they settled down and the instructor got going. And the flying boat in those days had no instrumentation. When I say no instrumentation, it had a rev counter, a compass, and a piece of string drawn across in front of you, which was your horizon. Sitting in the aeroplane, it was an open cockpit, but darn cold sometimes. And I remember it was Tiny White, was the Air Commodore now. He's gone, of course. But he used to say, Lawson, fly your aeroplane like you ride the bike, on the seat of your pants. And that's how he'd feel it. It was quite the experience. And I will say that for the flying school, nobody was ever hurt. Of course, it was safety was the motto, and we only flew in good conditions. And had our test. Oh, we thought we were Christmas. Once you went solo, we had to watch, of course, the glassy water when it was calm, because you could see right through it. But if you didn't and you strike the surface, it's like iron, and you just go straight up again. After we'd done so many hours solo, the pilots approved. We were examined by 2 English Army, we call them brass hats. And if you passed the test, you got your wings and you thought you were made. But we hadn't even learned to fly.
In the South Island, Sir Henry Wigram followed the Walshes by starting the Canterbury Aviation School at Sockburn, Christchurch, on the airfield which now bears his name, Wigram. These were the only 2 private flying schools in the British Empire training men for the Royal Flying Corps at the applicant's own expense. Altogether, the Canterbury Aviation School trained 100 pupils, and the Walshes 110 pilots, half the world away from the realities of war. France, 1914 to 1918. One of the most highly decorated aces to come through this conflict was Keith Caldwell, one of only 2 pupils on the very first course at the New Zealand Flying School.
Well, after Walsh Brothers, we got on board a boat for England, the 2 of us, which and the fare was £100, which we thought was a rather expensive way of going to a war. When we got home, we didn't waste any time before seeing the RFC interviewer, and we thought he was impressed with the fact that we'd flown an airplane in New Zealand and also come about 12,000 miles to enlist, so we were readily accepted. And then we shortly after that, we were given £50 to buy our kit. Wasn't enough quite. And then shortly after that we started our training, which took about 10 weeks. So at the end of 10 weeks, having flown 5 types of airplanes, and we'd completed 23 hours about, We had our wings up, which we were glad to have. And then we were shot overseas very soon after that, because they were, casualties were heavy, they were short of pilots. In an Army observation squadron, so the work was arduous and stamina testing, I think I would regard it that way after about 6 months there. Mainly ranging our guns onto enemy targets, which the observer did in the front seat. Now, that was rather arduous because we had to fly up and down a little bit over the German lines, not very high up in order to get a good view, and we were pestered the whole time by anti-aircraft fire. Therefore, we had to dodge about a bit and make certain the wing didn't get in the way for the observer to see the target. And most times you got a few holes through your wings. They were only canvas, so they patched up. As long as they weren't through the chaps, it's all right. The tempo of air fighting increased tremendously in the last 2 years of the war. And looking back on it, the odds favoured the Germans. It would have been better to have been a German pilot than a British one, because they stayed behind their lines, therefore we had to go across to get them in order to get on with it, which we did. Air fighting has been rather likened to an exciting match, sporting match, in which it was vital to win the game and rather could be fatal to lose it.
After the war, the Walsh's flying school entered a new and hopeful phase. Even the government's continued lack of interest couldn't quell the general excitement which greeted their ventures into commercial and civil aviation. To increase their stable, the Walsh brothers imported the very first 2 planes ever built by the giant Boeing Aircraft Corporation. And early height and distance records were won in these Boeings by George Bolt, a quiet man who was to prove the leading figure in the story of New Zealand aviation. The growing pains and perils of early charter flights didn't bother Bishop Cleary, who became famous as the Flying Bishop. His diocesan visits were always greeted with tremendous enthusiasm. The first airmail flight was made by George Bolt in 1919 from Auckland to Dargaville. It was encouraged by Sir Joseph Ward in his capacity as Postmaster General, the only person in government to show either interest or vision in the future of aviation. Faith was needed, for the planes could not always be guaranteed to reach their destinations. Flying certainly appealed to the general public. One woman passenger noted, "There is none of the continuous fiddling with the steering wheel that one experiences in a motor car." People began to envisage the day when the skies over Auckland would be full of aircraft. George Bolt bestrode the aviation scene from before the First World War through to many years after the Walsh brothers. His son, Air Marshal Sir Richard Bolt, was actually born at the flying school.
Well, Peter, I always see my father as one of a rather small number of pioneers who played a rather unique part in the development of aviation in this country. Round about the time of the Walsh Brothers School, you know, there were no established careers to strive for, and being totally involved meant taking a hand in designing, in building, and for everyone those days it meant taking a hand in the fixing of aeroplanes, and there was plenty of that to do. And in short, they were generalists in aviation in every way, rather than specialists. And because they had seaplanes and flying boats at the Walsh Brothers School, then of course it meant getting your hands dirty, getting aircraft fixed and started and bringing them back again. And It was a very general and total experience indeed. And I think in my father's case, certainly, this kind of experience gave them almost a sixth sense, a very deep sense of judgment and intuition about aviation matters. And I think great foresight that went with their great beliefs in the future. Give you an example, you know, I can recall when I was a small boy, first building model aircraft about the end of the 20s or early 30s, and I can remember my father saying to me, when you're a man, all the fastest aircraft will have delta wings. He said, even the ordinary aircraft that you fly from one place to another in will have thin, swept back wings like that. Well, I doubt if he could have proved it scientifically or mathematically at the time, but as we all know, he was right, and he was very often right, and so his group of people, similar people, so often right, and I've always, I must say, had great respect for them for that reason. But there's no doubt, and I don't think it's a matter for regret, it's a fact, that there will be no more general aviation people cast in quite the same mould.
For George Bolt and the Walshes, in spite of wide public interest, there was a feeling of despondency in the air. Without the spur of war, aviation was in trouble. To raise money, the Walshes offered joyrides to keep the flying school going. But the government's conservatism led to the end of airmail flights and the hope of establishing regular services.
The government also had no idea what to do with its gift of 33 war surplus aircraft from Britain, reluctantly accepted from an original offer of 100. It gave most of them away. It was a time of doldrums for flying. The flying school was forced to close down. For the Walsh brothers, it was the end. There's no memorial to them. And throughout most of the 1920s, hardly any flying at all took place in New Zealand. Hang gliding is no new sport, although a lot of people think so. And I dare say quite a few hang glider pilots themselves would be amazed to learn that none other than the ubiquitous George Bolt was successfully experimenting with biplane gliders here off the Port Hills near Christchurch in 1911. For real enthusiasts like Bolt, the lean years for flying through the 1920s must have been a sore frustration. One of the few who kept a lively interest in aviation during these lean years was Bill Dinny, who died recently and whose phonograph collection is one of the largest of its sort in the world. It'll soon be leaving the boat sheds by the river here for a museum. Bill was an enthusiast for many things. He built his own small plane, a Parasol, and was delighted when the legendary aviator, Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, took a personal interest in it. In fact, Kingsford Smith flew Bill Dinny's plane at Wigram, and the event was duly recorded for posterity when his home-built midget was parked for a photograph afterwards underneath the wing of the Southern Cross. The arrival of Kingsford Smith in the Southern Cross in September 1928 here at Wigram heralded a widespread revival of aviation in New Zealand. Kingsford Smith was world famous, and flying in this country literally broadened onto the international plane. But at the time, the excitement of the event overshadowed everything else.
Doug Syme, who was an Air Force cadet, and Fred Merrin, who was enrolled as the first airman in 1923, recall that occasion.
Well, the first thing we knew about him coming over was when he circled Wellington. And after circled Wellington, he headed south to Christchurch. But we didn't know at the time his radio had been knocked out through electrical storm over the Tasman.
Doug, how did you know that Kingsford Smith was on his way?
But the first I knew, I got a telephone ring about 7 in the morning to say he was flying over Wellington and to come out to Wickham as soon as possible to help to control the crowd. And I arrived out on the old motorbike, and by that time I was well behind. There was thousands out of Wickham, and I couldn't even get in the gate, but left the old motorbike outside and tore inside. And I couldn't believe the sight. There was just thousands of people there, sort of. So where they came from, well, I wouldn't know.
Well, you were both on crowd control. Fred, how did the crowd control work?
Awful. Once he tacked it up to a certain position, the crowd took charge, and he had to cut his motors.
What did Kingsford Smith and his crew look like when they got out?
Well, when they got out, they looked very, very fresh. Smithy was the first one to get out, of course, and he was followed by Al, but they stood down there, but really they were absolutely surrounded by people, and it was just hard to see just how they did really look. But as they were getting down, you could see them, but he looked very, very fresh, really, and I think he was very pleased to be here, by the sound of things. Well, by the look of him, anyway.
The Tasman was still a formidable barrier for a single-engine solo aircraft. The Southern Cross had had 3 engines and a crew of 4. And although Francis Chichester had flown from London to Sydney in 1930, he made the last leg of his long journey to New Zealand by sea.
The arrival of such internationally acclaimed aviators did much for the prestige of flying, and they were met with tremendous enthusiasm. The most significant effect of this increasing contact with the rest of the flying world was the final end to the lean years New Zealand aviation had suffered in the 1920s. The first successful solo Tasman crossing ended unconventionally, to say the least. For Guy Menzies landed not on a smooth brown paddock, but in a west coast Pākehī swamp. It took some explaining, and he set 2 records, for it was also the first phone call from Hokitika to Sydney.
You're at Hoki where?
Jean Batten was the first woman to cross the Tasman in 1936, at the end of her epic flight from England. She was already one of the foremost airwomen in the world, having flown solo from Britain to Australia in 1934.
Our idea was pioneering for the air routes. I remember that last part, the Tasman crossing, very vividly because I was very tired, but I was determined to go on. Looking back now, nothing could compensate me for the thrill of being the very first person ever to land at Mangere from England.
I was able to fly through from England to New Zealand in the fastest time in the history of the world, and I think I can say without doubt this is the very greatest moment of my life.
1929 to 1939 was the golden age of the aeroclubs. They sprang up in many parts of the country as a result of the tremendous public interest in flying inspired by Kingsford Smith. 10 magnificent years from Kingsford Smith and the Southern Cross till the outbreak of World War II, which was to accelerate and change the whole pattern and technology of aviation.
In responding to Kingsford Smith's challenge, the new aeroclubs were to provide the engineering skills and the pilots so vital to the gradual rebirth of New Zealand's commercial aviation. It was a time of barnstorming, joyriding, and numerous air pageants. safety standards were nothing like as rigorous as they are today.
I see Bill's got one of them new Model Ts.
There was a compulsive determination to get into the air, somehow, anyhow. Separate and organised club gliding came much later. The New Zealand Gliding Association was founded in 1947, and the first meetings started up in the 1950s. By the 1970s, there were 24 clubs with over 2,000 members, and yet this was a paradox because gliding is a very individual way of flight.
What do you think of that, Hannah? Can you manage it?
Yeah, I think so.
Not worried about the lake?
Dick Georgeson of Christchurch has gained several world gliding records and regards New Zealand as a glider pilot's dream.
The only opportunities we have of breaking world gliding records is by using the standing waves produced by the Southern Alps. In other words, the westerly wind blows across the Tasman, hits the Southern Alps, drops its moisture on the west coast, and comes over the plains as a hot, warm wind and rises to great altitudes. And it's these standing waves which we've been able to use to break altitude records and distance records.
At first, all flying epitomised the challenge of man in the air. Much of that's gone, but gliding has kept the spirit and the individual freedom of flight.
Gliding is a thing one can never master, or something where one pits oneself against the elements and uses the elements to climb to greater altitudes or to travel distances. It's entirely by wind and assessment of the weather. One never fathoms or fully understands air movements, and it's a perpetual challenge and a very exhilarating one. It can be very lonely, and I think in life one has to be frightened every now and again. It does one good and makes one appreciate the wonderful experience living is.
This J3 pre-war Piper Cub is part of the New Zealand Sport and Vintage Aviation Society's collection of aircraft at Hood Aerodrome near Masterton. The White Tailor craft, a beautifully restored tiger moth. But perhaps their proudest possession of all is the DH-89B, or de Havilland Domini. Its first owner was Union Airways, one of the first of 4 local domestic airlines that came into being in the mid-1930s to link our main cities and towns by air.
Cook Strait Airways had George Bolt as its chief pilot and technical advisor, and the single fare from Wellington to Nelson was 27 shillings and sixpence. Air Travel was founded by Bert Mercer, who became somewhat of a legend on the West Coast as a flying Good Samaritan, even to dropping in for a cup of tea with the daily paper, which he frequently did. Although these were hard economic times, struggling out of the Depression, an enormous amount of goods and merchandise was carried by air. In a notoriously mountainous region, railways had been slow to develop, and in fact ground communications of any sort were immensely difficult. Air travel became unusually vital for linking small and isolated settlements. Union Airways was the biggest of the domestic airlines, and it set up its main base at Palmerston North, which was considered the logical centre from which all future air services would branch. Short flights were given every weekend. These were immensely popular and, of course, good public relations. The first Electras arrived in 1937, fast, all-metal airliners capable of carrying 10 passengers at 165 miles per hour. By 1937, New Zealand was one of the leading air travelling countries in the world per head of population. But for all that, facilities at Invercargill Airport, as recently as 1950, make one realise that these were still early days. The very ruggedness of so much of this country, which gave the early domestic airlines such an important and welcome role, provided an unusual requirement for the surveying of the land from the air. In 1936, Piet van Asch of Hastings founded Aerial Mapping Limited, the only aviation company in New Zealand to have survived from the 1930s. Regular aerial photographic work is carried on throughout the country and in the South Pacific.
I'm ready.
Until he retired last year, Piet van Asch continued to head the company, a precise craftsman and meticulous enthusiast for the aircraft he flies.
This Beechcraft has given us faithful service for over 36 years. She is one of the most stable of all aircraft and an absolute delight to fly. The Monospar, of course, is our real veteran. I purchased her back in July 1936. Being so economical, she saw us through those very early and difficult years of mapping. She is the only monospar in the world still flying today.
The ageing Beechcraft will soon be presented to the Museum of Transport and Technology in Auckland. A gift from a company which continues to play a significant role in the mapping of the land.
Modern and well-equipped, the Royal New Zealand Air Force stands ready to protect our shores. Our airmen have established a magnificent record of skill, courage and daring. And under the Empire Air Training Scheme, thousands are pouring from New Zealand's training schools each year to speed our Empire's mastery of the air.
In spite of the bold words of the propaganda films, we were anything but ready for the onset of World War II. In a way, it was history repeating itself. Even in England, Lancasters, like this one in retirement at Motat, didn't enter the war until considerably later. For New Zealand, the development of the Air Force in the decade before the war was slow. In 1929, the Permanent Air Force was part of the Army, and a recruiting film of the time opens with a lineup of aircraft straight out of World War I. In the
the 10 years from that film to the outbreak of war, there were, of course, some developments. The early 1930s saw Air Force ranks replace the old Army titles. But by 1936, the newly formed independent RNZAF still had only 20 officers and 100 airmen. By then, 2 flights of impressive but cumbersome Vickers-Wildebeest bombers had arrived from England. But we were more or less on the outbrink of war itself before the first 5 airspeed Oxfords arrived for advanced training. Incredibly, the onset of war took us back to biplanes. For during the war, de Havilland Tiger Moths were built in the special factory constructed at Rongotai. The Tiger Moths were built as part of the wartime Commonwealth Air Training Programme and were used as basic trainers. In all, more than 13,000 pilots and airmen passed through New Zealand training schools, and by the end of the war, the Rongotai factory, which is now the Wellington Domestic Terminal's reception area and lounge, had built more than 400 Tiger Moths. New Zealanders were soon overseas in Europe and North Africa. 30 of these Wellington bombers had been ordered for the defence of New Zealand, but they were held back for more urgent duties. One New Zealander, who served in Bomber Command and later became British Chief of Air Staff, was Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Elworthy.
When talking about New Zealanders serving in the Air Force in Europe, I think the thing one has to remember is that before the war, there was a New Zealand Army, there was a New Zealand Navy, small though they may have been, but those who wanted to fly in the war really had little choice at that in the early stages but to join the Royal Air Force. And so the Royal Air Force had a bigger proportion of New Zealanders in it than the British Army or the British Navy. And when they came to England, of course, they were members of the Royal Air Force, not of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. And those are the ones who fought mainly in Europe, in Bomber Command and in Fighter Command and in Coastal Command. In Fighter Command, of course, they early made their name because the Battle of Britain was one of the great air battles and took part in the early part of the war. And the man who obviously springs first to mind is Keith Park, who commanded 11 Group, which was the group, fighter group, which really took the brunt of the Battle of Britain. And he led it and he inspired it.
Group Captain Colin Gray of Pukerua Bay recalls those hectic days.
During the height of the Battle of Britain, we were kept pretty busy the whole time, from sometimes as early as about 5 o'clock in the morning until nightfall, which of course in the English summer's round about 10 o'clock or even later. We were kept very busy. It depended on the weather. On a good day, that's from the weather point of view, we might fly 4 or 5 sorties, and this was pretty tiring. We're usually only given a very short time to scramble, and we were usually at a height disadvantage because the controllers on the ground were waiting to see which way the raids were going to go. So this meant that we were usually attacked from above and always, of course, in vastly superior numbers. At a much later stage in the war, fighter aircraft were again used in defence of London against flying bombs.
Then in Bomber Command, there was only one actual New Zealand squadron. That was number 75 Squadron, but they acted like most of the other squadrons in Bomber Command. They too, they were not all New Zealanders. Australian squadrons, New Zealand squadrons, but they had British people, and of course in host of the ordinary RAF bomber squadrons, there were New Zealanders serving in them. And they took part in the bomber raids throughout the war.
In 1941, Japan entered the war by striking at Pearl Harbor, and the threat of aggression and invasion came suddenly much closer to our shores. It brought the air war to the Pacific and caught us once again woefully unprepared.
Fiji, where this Singapore-class flying boat was based, was a vital link in the Allied chain of island bases. Through 1942, Japan advanced rapidly and virtually unchecked across the Pacific until Australia and New Guinea were in grave danger. We were desperately in need of more modern aircraft to fight a modern war. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first American air-sea victory, the turning of the tide. Air Vice Marshal Douglas St. George fought in the Pacific in the early stages when we too were in frequent contact with Japanese fighter aircraft.
Well, I commanded 17th Squadron in 1943. We called ourselves the Fighting 17th, and our task was to provide a fighter escort for the bombers making attacks against Japanese airfields. And of course, as these attacks came in, one could see the Japanese Zeros taking off to defend themselves. In these attacks against the airfields, of course, there were casualties on both sides. I think in general terms, we came off better than the Japanese. But one day we lost something like 15 pilots, which was a black day for New Zealand, I must say.
As the Americans and Allies drove the Japanese north, New Zealand's air war slackened, even though Japanese ground forces were often within a short distance of our airfields. On Bougainville Island, No. 3 Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron was commanded by Air Vice Marshal, then Wing Commander, Ian Morrison.
But after mid-44, we had a feeling that the war had got away from us a bit. The sharp end of it was further north. However, we had our moments in the rest of that war, and we had our casualties, particularly on low-level operations. This was flying at treetop height. And we learned to respect the Japanese gunners, particularly, I remember, the gunners on Cape St. George on the way into Rabaul from the south, and those other chaps up around Keviang on the north of New Ireland. Our main task at that time was to harass the Japanese ground forces and to prevent their mounting attacks, particularly in Bougainville, where the perimeter was only a short way from our airfield bases.
Even in the later stages of the Pacific Air War, the crews of aircraft shot down on missions still had to be searched for and rescued by Catalina patrols.
The Catalina had the capacity to make an open sea landing. It was a flat plane. I don't think patrols ever became boring when you're looking for people. Dumbo was the rescue airplane, and people were probably in rafts anywhere in the Pacific. The sooner Dumbo could get them, either from the coast watchers if they were ashore, or if they were in their dinghy, the better. Some remarkable rescue work carried out. I wouldn't like to measure the success, except everyone that had to fly, I'm sure, had the greatest faith that if they did go down, the Dumbo aircraft would be unrelenting in trying to find them and lift them out. That if they could be lifted out, they would.
At the peak of the war, the Air Force's strength was up to about 50,000 men and women. And what a wonderful team they were. Then came the bomb, Hiroshima, and the end of it all. In all theaters, in Europe, in the desert, the Far East, and in the Pacific, the Royal New Zealand Air Force had about 10,000 chaps actually flying in the air during that war. And we had about half of them killed.
The war certainly cost us a great deal in terms of human life. But as so often with such upheavals, it also brought great advances. For the acceleration of technology in the 6 years of the war alone literally took us from biplane to jet aircraft. In terms of flight, the war's legacy was the modern age. It all seems a long time ago now, the end of World War II, I mean. But it was just after the large-scale disbanding of RNZAF squadrons and aircrew that NAC, our first national airways corporation, was formed, and we took a big step towards air transport as it is now. By 1948, NAC had absorbed most of the country's existing domestic airlines and gained a virtual monopoly of our domestic air routes. Military aircraft, Douglas Dakotas, DC-3s of RNZAF Transport Command, were pressed into civil use. The refurbishing and changeover of these Dakotas was carried out in Melbourne because, of course, at the time, NAC's own large workshops at Christchurch Airport had still to be built. RNZAF pilots, back from wartime service, were retrained in this country for their new civilian role. As the Dakotas and Lodestars were brought into use, air traffic expanded at a tremendous rate. In the first 3 years after the war, passenger numbers increased threefold, miles flown fourfold, and freight carried sixfold.
Douglas Able Zebra from Herwood, you are clear to taxi to take
A farewell wave, and the Douglas airliner Picarda, once called Dakota 03 Baker 626, is airborne again.
In many ways, the immediate post-war years saw rapid changes. And when the Old Vic Theatre Company toured New Zealand in 1948 with a cast headed by Sir Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, it helped to make the public in general aware that we were once more forging stronger bonds than ever with the rest of the world.
For many years after the war, our airports lagged behind the growth of the airline they served. On most, the wartime flavour lingered, with facilities little more than a few wooden huts. In a temporary move, which was to last for 12 years, Wellington's commercial air traffic was shifted from Rongotai here to Paraparaumu. Several years actually passed before work started on the long job of extending the new runway out into Lyall Bay. Finally, after 6 years of construction, the new Rongotai was opened in 1959. The passenger terminal was still based on the old wartime Tiger Moth factory. The domestic part still is, and yet, for a while, Rongotai was the country's most modern airport.
Kingsford Smith, an immortal in our history and aviation history, came here but couldn't get down because Wellington was covered with clouds.
Rongotai was host to an impressive lineup of dignitaries and to a guest list of New Zealand and overseas aircraft. The ceremony had a near disaster when one of the Vulcan bombers from Britain misjudged its approach and undershot the beginning of the runway. By piling on full power, it managed to climb clear and later made a superb emergency landing at Ohakea. This was Rongotai's day, a far cry from the time it had only one man on its permanent staff. He had forecast the weather by stepping out of his hut and gazing towards the Rimutakas. He reckoned this was all he needed to forecast conditions as far afield as Palmerston North and Christchurch. Flying boats were a familiar sight, as we were still using them. They gave the crowd their money's worth on home ground.
Oh, you see there?
For many years, seaplane bases were more important to Auckland and Wellington than airfields. It was in Auckland that the crews of British Imperial Airways and Pan American Airways flying boats met in Christmas week of 1937. They were surveying the new air routes which were soon to link us for the first time on regular schedules with the United States, Britain, Australia and the Pacific. New Zealand's own international airline was Tasman Empire Airways, or Teal. It was founded in 1940 and operated Empire-class and Solent flying boats. These huge craft were replaced by DC-6s in 1954, although one last Solent, the Aranui, carried on until as late as 1960, when Captain Joe Shepherd brought it home from Fiji for the last time.
You could say that the years 1937 to 1960 marked the end of New Zealand's isolation by air from the rest of the world. Travel in those days by flying boat was a very romantic and leisurely experience.
Perhaps you can see the flight deck later on.
If you like, we'll see what can be arranged.
Yes, sounds a fine idea for you two.
Besides the Tasman crossing, I flew the coral route to the Pacific Islands. 2.5 days to Tahiti, which was quite unspoilt in those days. There was plenty of time to spend ashore during stops in Samoa and the Cook Islands. The big jets of today may travel faster and higher, but when the flying boats finally retired, it was the end of a rather memorable age.
Several years before the flying boats were phased out, Teal was crossing the Tasman with DC-6s. Then in 1965, within 5 years of the last flying boat, Teal converted to the age of the big jet. The same year, the airline changed its name to Air New Zealand. The following year, Auckland's new international airport at Mangere here was opened with a spectacular pageant which drew enormous crowds and many civil and military aircraft from overseas. A Mangere vastly grown since its first international contact when Jean Batten arrived at the end of her epic flight from England.
I was tremendously impressed to see how it had spread, and the little 600-yard grass strip, which was cut specially for me to land on in 1936, has now grown to a tremendous international airport. It must be one of the most beautiful airports in the world.
The post-war years have been ones of tremendous change for aviation. For many of us, it's become part of life we take for granted. It wasn't only the airlines that benefited from the boost the war gave to flying. In 1949, the pilots were there and the machines they'd flown, ready to try something more individual. For these modern pioneers aimed to fulfill an age-old vision. They would literally turn the sword into a ploughshare. Civilians and Air Force worked together in these first aerial top-dressing trials, which were to prove the spearhead of a revolution in our use of the land. The aircraft chosen was a Grumman Avenger, pouring superphosphate from its bomb bay, and the trials owed much to the drive and inspiration of E.A. Gibson, who was appointed Director of Civil Aviation in 1947. Convincing often sceptical farmers of the benefits of top-dressing their land from the air was not easy. But by the end of 1949, the year of the trials, 5 aerial top-dressing companies were in business. In those early years, the bulk of top-dressing planes were Tiger Moths, adapted from their role as Air Force trainers.
Your prices aren't too bad. I could get super on the whole place.
From makeshift beginnings, the new industry developed rapidly. It was to bring in vast areas of hill country which could not have been developed in any other way. In the first 12 years of aerial top-dressing, New Zealand's cattle and sheep numbers increased by a staggering 50%. The number of farm airstrips was to reach 20,000. Aerial top dressings become so widespread it's hard to believe the idea was ridiculed at first. But Lawson Field, who founded one of the first 5 companies, remembers.
We went in once into Waitahora Valley, called down to have a meeting with the farmers. They were all sceptical, everyone. And I can see it now. There was Mr. Sir Keith Hollyoak there, and we were having a meeting in an army hut, pouring with rain, And Keith, as I say, all the farmers said it can't be done by an airplane. So Keith said, I'll give it a go. And that was Keith Hollyoak for you. We went in and did his, and eventually, believe it or not, we came out with practically having done practically every farmer. Even to an old Irishman who was just outside the fence, leaning over there one day, and he was watching this. He said it was impossible at the meeting. And about 2 days later, he came over to me and said, oh, will you do mine for me? And we did his top dressing.
Lawson Field was also the first to pioneer the use of longer-range, heavy aircraft, such as the Lodestar, which could spread nearly 20 hectares to the load. Another of the first 5 in aerial top dressing was Ozzie James, who now heads James Aviation, one of the world's largest private agricultural top dressing companies.
30 years ago this year, I arrived in Hamilton with this aircraft, a caravan and an old truck, and set up business in the Raglan district. Since that period, the company has continued to grow till today. We have 60 aircraft operating throughout New Zealand and in the Solomon Islands. We're flying 340,000 tonnes of fertiliser on and a couple of million gallons of chemicals. The company is involved in many other things in addition, but our prime function is agricultural aviation, which we have made our main thrust.
The mid-50s saw the first Fletcher, a now familiar shape in our skies. To begin with, Fletchers were designed and built in the United States, specifically for aerial top dressing in this country. In 1966, Aerospace of Hamilton bought the exclusive rights to manufacture the Fletcher in New Zealand. The company will soon be putting its turbo-powered Cresco into full production, but plans to continue with the versatile Fletcher for many years to come. Fletchers carry out more than half of all New Zealand's agricultural flying and have been exported to several countries, including the United States.
Right from the early days, New Zealanders have shown versatility in the air. But one of the most diverse applications has been in our use of the helicopter, a machine beautifully suited to our mountainous terrain and with the capacity to fly into most inaccessible places.
Although so widely used now, helicopters didn't arrive in New Zealand until well after the war. The first was imported by James Aviation in 1954. Within 20 years, we had more than 100, servicing offshore oil rigs, performing valuable work ferrying geologists and survey teams into remote places, and carrying an astonishing variety of loads. One of the early uses, spraying crops or gorse, has remained the most successful because of the turbulent action of the rotors. But perhaps the most widespread use has been in deer hunting. Towards the end of the 70s, deer hunters ran into problems as costs went up and deer became scarce. But then deer farming arrived, and the recovery of live deer now more than rivals hunting for profitability. But the risks remain in this very taxing field of aviation.
Flying tourists into the Mount Cook National Park makes up quite a large part of my job. And the Hawker Siddeley 748, one of the success stories of British aviation, is a superb aircraft in this challenging country.
Rudolph Wigley, founder of the Mount Cook Company, was one of the first to recognise the tourist potential of the Southern Alps. His son, Sir Henry Wigley, had already seen the possibilities of flying people into Mount Cook when war service intervened.
When we got into commercial flying again after the war, we started hunting around with the idea of getting for the Osters that we were then operating. We couldn't get any around the world, and so we set out to design our own. And we finally manufactured a trial set, and about 25 years ago came up here and did the first landing. That was the beginning. Everyone said we were crackers to try it, and they thought we were going to leave airplanes and passengers marooned on the snow. And we certainly had a lot of problems for a start. We got airplanes stuck and we damaged our gear, but we gradually improved on it until it's probably the major tourist attraction of New Zealand today. We carry about 50,000 people onto the snow every year. One of the things that makes the ski plane trip so exciting and unusual for tourists is that they leave dry airfields with high temperatures, 90, 95 degrees, and within 15 minutes they're in amongst the permanent snow. You might be in Antarctica. The change is so fast that it's dramatic.
Taking the first occasional sightseeing planes into Mount Cook between the wars had been a precarious business, for the weather frequently turned them back. And it was not until the late 1940s that tourist flying really got going. Again, it was the wartime pilots like Popeye Lucas of Queenstown, returning home full of zest and initiative, who really got tourist flying off the ground.
Tourists are the difficult sort of a thing to start with, to try and encourage people to fly with you, because most of them are used to flying in large transcontinental aircraft, and they see our little single-engine one, they're a bit iffy about going up it, and quite often got old dears from the States saying, "Say, I'm not going up in that little ship, I'm used to a four-engine craft." And I'd say, "Well, this is much safer." And they said, "How do you make that out?" I said, "Oh, it's got 4 cylinders, you see, like that." Sometimes we get the Fox Glacier. One morning I remember particularly well is these 2 old girls came down about 6 o'clock in the morning on the Mount Cook bus to fly. One said, "This is my first time up, you know," and the other one says, "I've never been up before either." And I said, "Well, this is my first trip too." And they said, "Oh, do you think you'll manage?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'll give it a go," you see. And the most perfect morning, and you could see Mount Cook stark and clear, not a cloud in the sky. Climbing up towards the glacier with just the tiniest little tremor like that. And this old girl leant over and tapped me on the knee and said, "Now, naughty, naughty," like that. To see, well, we had to put up with a lot of that, and you had to talk people into flying.
Yet another wartime pilot who had an irresistible facility for talking people into flying was Captain Fred Ladd.
My wife and I had a fantastic time starting and developing the amphibian services to Great Barrier Island. Down the ramp into the damp, a shower of spray and we're away. What marvellous people out in the islands. Loving, friendly and wonderful. And then, of course, the ambulance cases, 100 per year we were doing. And the mothers were waiting 9 months and 1 day before they'd ring the bell, and then we'd go like hell. We were very, very sad indeed when we left the islands of the Gulf. An era of our life closed.
From Auckland, Fred Ladd moved to Rotorua to start his volcanic wonder flights over the North Island's thermal region, from White Island to Tongariro National Park, but particularly over the craters of Mount Tarawera. In both islands, small and often individually inspired enterprises have grown into successful operations, which have still not lost the flavour of their modest beginnings. Bertram Cornthwaite came to New Zealand as Inspector of Air Accidents. Now retired, he's been actively engaged in flight safety since 1943 and very aware of the vast increase in popular flying.
It's hardly surprising there's tremendous enthusiasm for aviation in New Zealand. The country's absolutely made for it. And there is enthusiasm. You'll see it in the flying clubs, gliding clubs, fly-ins, everywhere. There's no doubt at all that this enthusiastic approach did a tremendous amount for aviation and for the country in days gone by. And the New Zealand engineer too. In the earlier days, when aircraft were nearly all bought from Britain, he was 12,000 miles away from the manufacturer. So if he had any technical problems, he had to sort them out for himself. Couldn't ring up the manufacturer and find out what was wrong. And so this meant he had to develop the same sort of pioneer spirit that we saw in the flying types. There was the marvellous example of the Bristol freighters, that automatic loading scheme that they devised to load and unload the Bristol freighters. We had the chairman of the Bristol Aeroplane Company over here, and he said he'd never seen anything quite like it. This was later copied by other people, but at the time it was a first.
We've had our fair share of firsts in flight, and Auckland's Museum of Transport and Technology gives a wonderful insight into not just the machines, but the men who built them. Pioneers whose ingenuity and passionate involvement often had to overcome conservatism, ridicule, and numerous setbacks for them to fulfill their ideas and dreams.
One would reckon that if men were supposed to fly, they'd had wings, because that wasn't meant. That air belonged to birds, not to the human being. We saw him in the air, over the cliff turning. He turned for to go up the river.
Charlie wanted me to take him up with him on the bank. It didn't come off though, did it, Charlie? Don't know why.
I was able to fly through from England to New Zealand in the fastest time in the history of the world, and I think I can say without doubt this is the very greatest moment of my life.
Sitting in the aeroplane, which was an open cockpit, and down cold sometimes. And I remember he used to say, Lawson, fly your aeroplane like you ride the bike on the seat of your pants.
There's no doubt, and I don't think it's a matter for regret, it's a fact, that there will be no more general aviation people cast in quite the same mould.
Motat is very much an active place, with restoration and additions going on all the time in all sorts of aspects of transport and technology. But it's always been particularly strong on aviation. For a museum, it involves the public to an unusual degree. And it's interesting that in these sophisticated days of commercial aviation, multinational corporations and billion-dollar enterprises, there are still individual people successfully carrying on the pioneering tradition in garages and small private workshops. Backed by the Development Finance Corporation, Sam Water, who once designed for Fokker in Holland, works on the prototype of his powered glider.
Well, Peter, that's how she looks like. You could either fly it as a powered glider or remove the outer wing panels and use it as a conventional aeroplane. I've got the engine on the test stand now and I'm going to give it a test run.
Sam Water has called his aircraft Manurewa, recalling the Walsh brothers' first efforts at flight in Manurewa 1 before they started up their flying school. Somewhere halfway between the professional and the amateur enthusiast is Miles Robertson. Already skilled at restoring old planes to flying order, he's now totally rebuilding 3 Tiger Moths, starting from the renovated frames.
Barry Thompson is one of the most dedicated of a truly dedicated fraternity, the aircraft home builders, as they're called.
Barry, can you tell me about this aircraft home building business?
Well, it's not very difficult to build an aeroplane, providing the individual complies with the rules as laid down by the Department of Civil Aviation. And of course, the Amateur Aircraft Constructors Association offers a lot of help and guidance. And anyone that's interested in flying and can read a drawing and can use hand tools can build an aeroplane.
Hundreds of enthusiasts and more than 200 home-built aircraft gathered at this recent national fly-in on a private airfield at Tokoi near Hamilton. Although designs and kit sets became available during the 1960s and the New Zealand Amateur Aircraft Constructors Association was formed in 1964, the movement only really caught on during the 70s. It's astonishing to realize that every one of these machines was built by its owner and pilot. Very different in appearance, though not in spirit, to the first efforts at aircraft construction early in the century. A gathering like this is as much the heart and soul of flying as the smooth running of our domestic and international airlines. It's in the direct tradition of the early aero clubs, but with the knowledge of today. Aviation's certainly come a long way since Professor Baldwin first floated skyward in 1889, or Mad Dick Pierce worked in virtual isolation down at Waitoa, and since the Walsh brothers walked away from the wreckage of Manurewa 1, determined that for them, at least, it wouldn't be the end.